In the last section, we started talking about the application that we're going to build to learn more about multi-container deployments. In this section, we'll continue by talking about the back-end architecture that we're going to use to implement this application. All right, so here we go. Here's the back-end. Now, like I said, this is just over-the-top complicated, way more complicated than it needs to be by like a factor of 20. But I'm showing you this much more complicated backend just to give you an idea of how we can take these multiple containers or multiple components and fit them together into one application. Now this right here is a diagram of the development flow or the development architecture of our application. So when we eventually push this into a production deployment, some of these pieces in here are going to change just a little bit, but I'll be sure to tell you exactly how they are going to change. So when a user boots up their browser and tries to visit our application, they're going to first visit an Nginx web server, very similar to the one we had previously. The Nginx server is going to essentially do some routing. This server is going to decide whether the browser is trying to access a React application to get some front-end assets, like the HTML file or some JavaScript file that will be used to build this application. If the browser is trying to access some front-end assets like an HTML file or a JavaScript file, it will automatically route the incoming request to a running React server. If the incoming request is instead trying to access some backend API that we are going to use for submitting numbers and reading numbers and retrieving values, all that kind of good stuff, then the Nginx server right here will instead route the request to a Express server. So this Express server right here is going to function as our API that's going to serve up information or calculated values up to the front-end application. Now, let me show you a couple more diagrams that's going to better explain this process right here. Okay, so you might have noticed that on the last diagram, we had these worker, Redis, and Postgres things over here. Remember that Redis is an in-memory data store, and it's very commonly used for housing temporary or kind of cached values of sorts. I've also got Postgres right here, which is a database very similar to, say, MySQL. So you might have noticed that in our web application mockup, we had kind of these two sets of values right here. We had first values that the application has seen, or essentially values that have been submitted to the application. All of the information for this values I have seen is going to be stored in a Postgres database. And so you can kind of imagine that values I have seen right here, or really indices I have seen, is a very permanent stored set of data, all coming from Postgres. On the other hand, the calculated values that are going to be displayed right here, all this information is going to be displayed in a separate Redis database instead. And so again, we're just making this over the top complicated, way more complicated than it has to be. We have essentially identical data on the screen right here, but we're just going to arbitrarily say that, oh yeah, this source of data is coming from Postgres, this source of data is coming from Redis over here. Again, we're just doing that to make this a little bit more complicated and show you how you would work with these different sources of data in a single application. Now let me show you a flow of how our application is really going to behave behind the scenes. So let's imagine that a user submits a number to the React application. Like let's say they put a number into the form right here, and then click the submit button. So when a user clicks on that submit button, the React app is going to make an API request, or excuse me, an AJAX request to the backend Express server. The Express server, when it receives this number that it needs to calculate a Fibonacci number for, it's going to first take that number and store it inside of our Postgres database. Because remember, that's going to have a permanent list of all the indices that have ever been submitted to our application. At the same time, the Express server is also going to take that index and put it into the Redis database as well. When a new number shows up inside of our Redis database, it's going to wake up a separate backend Node.js process that we're going to refer to as the worker. The only job of this worker right here is to watch Redis for new indices that show up. Anytime a new index shows up inside of Redis, the worker is going to pull that value out. It will calculate the appropriate Fibonacci value for it. It'll take that calculated value and then put it back into Redis so that it can then be requested by the React application and eventually show up on the screen. So again, over the top complicated, I can't say it enough. I don't think you would end up building a Redis, or excuse me, a Fibonacci calculator application with this type of flow right here, this type of architecture. But again, I just wanted to show you a multi-container deployment. So now that we've got a better idea of how all this works, let's take a quick pause. We're going to come back to the next section and we'll start putting this application together from scratch. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute.